This wasn't just prejudice. This was a divine mandate for hatred. It was an idea so powerful it would echo through empires, justify massacres, and lay the theological groundwork for the greatest crimes in human history. But how could a religion supposedly founded on love give birth to such a uniquely poisonous concept? To understand, we have to go back to the very beginning, to a moment of schism and a tragic theological turn. In the first centuries after Christ, a new faith was struggling to define itself against its parent, Judaism. Out of this struggle came a doctrine known as supersessionism. The idea was simple and devastating, that the new Christian covenant with God had replaced or superseded the old covenant with the Jewish people. They were now seen as a relic, a people who had failed to recognize their own Messiah. But it was how the story of the crucifixion was told and retold that would light the fuse. The Gospels, written decades after the event by men who had never witnessed it, began a subtle but profound shift. The responsibility for the execution, a punishment carried out exclusively by the Roman state, was increasingly placed on Jewish authorities and the Jewish people as a whole. This wasn't just a historical inaccuracy, it was the creation of a villain, and soon the most influential voices in the early church would take this narrative and forge it into a weapon. Men like St. John Chrysostom in the 4th century delivered sermons dripping with venom, calling synagogues dens of scoundrels and the homes of demons. He and others cemented a terrible charge, an accusation unique in all of history: deicide, the killing of a god. With that one word, the Jewish people were transformed in the Christian imagination. They were no longer just neighbors with a different faith. They were the cosmic enemies of God, eternally cursed and stained with the blood of Christ. But how did these words, spoken in churches and written on scrolls, leap from the page and into the streets, into the law, and into the shedding of blood? The answer came as Christianity became the dominant power in Europe. In the year 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council made church doctrine into the law of the land. It decreed that Jews must live in segregated quarters, the first ghettos, and wear identifying badges on their clothing to protect Christians from their influence. This legal segregation was a direct consequence of the Deicide charge. Then came the Crusades. As armies marched east to reclaim the Holy Land, they first turned their fury on the infidels at home. Entire Jewish communities along the Rhine River were massacred by mobs, who saw it as a holy act to avenge the death of their Savior. This religious fervor spawned monstrous lies like the blood libel, the accusation that Jews murdered Christian children to use their blood in Passover rituals. It was a grotesque fantasy, a direct evolution of the idea that a people who could kill God would stop at nothing. For centuries, this engine of dehumanization churned, grinding the Jewish people down under the weight of law, myth, and violence. It created a cultural bedrock of hatred so deep that it would survive the decline of religious authority itself. As Europe entered the modern age, the religious justification began to wane, but the hatred remained. In the 19th century, the new pseudoscience of race gave the old poison a new bottle. The malevolent Christ killer of theology became the biologically corrupt Semite of racial theory. The Nazis did not have to invent antisemitism. They inherited it. They took the 2,000-year-old archetype of the Jew as a demonic, conspiratorial other and simply updated the language. The ghetto walls of the Middle Ages became the barbed wire of Auschwitz. The yellow badge of the Lateran Council became the yellow star. The Holocaust was the industrial, systematic, and secular culmination of a religious idea. We tell ourselves that this is all ancient history, a darkness we have left behind. But we are wrong. The idea of deicide, the Christ-killer libel, may be spoken less often today, but its ghost haunts us. It has mutated. It now lives in the conspiracy theories of a secret global cabal controlling banks and media. It lives in the rhetoric that paints the Jewish people as a single, malevolent entity with sinister ambitions. The patterns of thought are identical, a small, uniquely powerful, and evil group responsible for the world's ills. Understanding this history is not an academic exercise. It is an urgent moral necessity. It is a warning that ideas have consequences and that dehumanization, once given a divine or ideological blessing, is a fire that is almost impossible to control. We must learn to recognize the echoes of this ancient lie in all its modern forms before they are allowed to grow into a roar once more. Before Auschwitz, before pogroms, there was medieval Europe, the blueprint for hate. To understand the industrial-scale slaughter of the 20th century, we must travel back in time, back to a world of knights and cathedrals, a world that laid the foundation stone by bloody stone for what was to come. Our story begins in the year 1096. Pope Urban II had called for a crusade, a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem. But for thousands of European Jews, the war came to them first. Mobs of peasants and petty knights, fired up with religious zeal, decided they did not need to travel thousands of miles to find an infidel. The enemy, they were told, lived right down the road, in the Jewish quarters of cities along the Rhine River. What followed were not battles, but massacres. Entire communities in cities like Worms and Mainz were put to the sword. The choice offered was simple and brutal: baptism or death. But what could possibly justify such savagery in the name of God? The justification was old, and it was potent. For centuries, a poisonous idea had been preached from the pulpit: the charge of deicide, the claim that all Jews for all time were collectively responsible for the death of Jesus. This theological accusation transformed neighbors into a cursed and malevolent people in the eyes of the faithful. It was the original sin for which they could never be forgiven. But this abstract accusation was about to take on a terrifyingly concrete and monstrous form. In the year 1144, in Norwich, England, a new horror was born: the blood libel. A young boy named William disappeared, and a rumor began to spread, a vile fantasy that Jews had kidnapped and murdered him to use his blood in their Passover rituals. This lie, this absolute fiction, spread like a plague across Europe. It was a perfect weapon. It required no evidence, and it was impossible to disprove. Every time a Christian child went missing, an entire Jewish community was put in mortal danger. But the persecution was not only spiritual, it was economic. As Christian society evolved, most professions were closed off to Jews. They could not join guilds. They could not own land. They were systematically pushed to the margins. One of the few avenues left open was money lending. Because Christian scripture forbade usury, the charging of interest, a financial vacuum was created. A vacuum that Jewish communities were forced to fill, often at the behest of the very kings and bishops who restricted their rights. This created a deadly paradox. They provided an essential service, funding kingdoms and commerce, but were simultaneously hated for it. They became the face of debt, caricatured as greedy and exploitative. And when a powerful lord owed too much money, what was an easier solution than simply eliminating the creditor? The final piece of the blueprint was to make this hatred visible, to write it onto the bodies of the accused. In the year 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council made it law. Jews were now required to wear distinguishing clothing, a yellow badge, a pointed hat. This was not a small detail. It was a tool of social control, a way to publicly mark, humiliate, and segregate. It made them a perpetual target, unable to escape the identity that had been forced upon them. It was a state-sanctioned license for prejudice. So the pieces were all in place: religious demonization, vicious conspiratorial myths, economic resentment, and legal segregation. This was the four-part architecture of hate, constructed over centuries. The expulsions from England, from France, from Spain, the pogroms that would follow, they all drew their logic from this medieval foundation. The patterns were set. The caricature of the greedy moneylender, the specter of the blood libel, the yellow star of shame. These things did not die in the Middle Ages. They were merely dormant, waiting to be revived and weaponized on a scale the medieval world could have never imagined. To study this history is to understand a terrifying process. It shows how dehumanization is not a sudden act, but a systematic construction. It begins with words, is codified by law, and culminates in violence. Recognizing this medieval blueprint is more than an academic exercise. It is a critical warning for our own time, a reminder that the seeds of hate, once planted, can lie dormant for centuries, waiting for the right conditions to grow again. History's darkest lie, it wasn't the plague that truly killed them. In the mid-14th century, a shadow fell over Europe. We call it the Black Death. A disease so swift, so merciless, it would erase nearly 1/3 of the continent's population. In a world without science, without an understanding of germs, a terrified population needed an answer. What they found was a lie that would prove more deadly than the pestilence itself. As the bodies piled up in the streets, a whisper started, a rumor that grew into a roar. The plague was not a natural disaster, they said. It was an act of deliberate evil. And soon, a specific, horrifying accusation began to take hold, targeting the one group already living on the edge of society: the Jews. The charge was as simple as it was monstrous: that Jewish people were poisoning the wells, the very source of life, to destroy Christendom. This conspiracy theory, born of fear and centuries of bigotry, spread faster than the disease. But on what grounds? What evidence could possibly support such a claim? The answer lies in the dungeons of medieval Europe. Under extreme torture, individuals would confess to anything. Men like Agamed of Geneva, a Jewish doctor, was made to confess to a vast international plot, providing a detailed but entirely fabricated account of a plan to poison all of Christian Europe. These coerced testimonies were then copied and distributed as undeniable proof. But the methods used to obtain them reveal a truth far more disturbing than the lie they were meant to support. With these confessions in hand, the mob was convinced, and their verdict was always the same: death. The pogroms began as a fire and soon became an inferno. In January of 1349, the entire Jewish community of Basel, Switzerland, was rounded up. They were herded onto a specially constructed wooden building on an island in the Rhine and burned alive. 1 month later, on February 14th, St. Valentine's Day, the city of Strasbourg, even before the plague had arrived there, murdered 2,000 of its Jewish citizens in one of the largest single massacres. They were offered a choice: convert to Christianity or die. Most chose death. These were not isolated incidents. From Spain to Poland, thousands upon thousands were slaughtered. Entire communities, which had existed for centuries, were wiped from the map in a matter of months. This was not a random outburst of violence. It was a systematic extermination, fueled by a lie that leaders, both secular and religious, were either unable or unwilling to stop. But this is not just a tragic chapter of a distant past. It was a blueprint. The lie of the well poisoner became a template for scapegoating, a foundational myth of antisemitism that would be revived again and again. The same mechanics of fear, misinformation, and the blaming of a minority for a society's crisis are not history. They are a warning. The Black Death was a biological contagion, but the hatred it unleashed was a disease of the human soul, a contagion we have yet to find a cure for. Before the ovens, there were theories. Before the camps, there was a book. This is the terrifying prequel to Ultimate Evil. For centuries, hatred against Jewish people was primarily religious. Conversion, in theory, was an escape. But in the 19th century, something changed. The poison mutated into a new, inescapable form. It was no longer about what you believed, but about what you were. What could possibly justify such a shift? The Industrial Revolution and the rise of nationalism were churning European society. In this chaos, people desperately sought simple answers for complex problems, and old prejudices found new, scientific-sounding language. This new hatred cloaked itself in the authority of science. Thinkers like Arthur de Gobineau and Houston Stewart Chamberlain began promoting theories of racial purity and Aryan superiority. They argued that humanity was divided into distinct hierarchical races, with the Semitic race positioned as inferior and corrupting. It was a complete fabrication, a pseudoscience built on fear, not facts. But how did this academic-sounding poison seep from intellectual circles into the minds of ordinary people? It needed a vehicle, a story that was simple, terrifying, and easy to spread. And that story arrived in the early 20th century, in the form of a book, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It claimed to be the secret minutes of a meeting of Jewish leaders plotting to achieve global domination. They would supposedly achieve this by controlling the media, corrupting economies, and manipulating governments. The text was vivid, detailed, and utterly convincing to those predisposed to believe it. There was just one problem. It was a complete and total fraud, a forgery likely created by the Russian secret police known as the Okhrana, to discredit revolutionaries and shore up the Tsar's failing regime. But the truth rarely travels as fast as a lie. How could a proven fake become one of the most influential and destructive texts in modern history? Despite being exposed as a forgery by the Times of London as early as 1921, the damage was done. The protocols spread like a virus across the globe. Henry Ford serialized it in his newspaper in the United States. In Germany, it became required reading for students. It provided the proof for the conspiracy theories that fueled the Nazi Party. It gave a narrative, a why, to their racial hatred. The theories from the 19th century now had a playbook, a supposed confession. This was not just history. The same mechanisms are at play right now. Pseudoscience, dressed up as legitimate research, spreads on social media. Elaborate conspiracy theories, presented as secret, uncovered truths, go viral in hours. The language changes, the medium is new, but the pattern is identical. It begins with just asking questions, with theories. It creates an other to blame for society's problems. We have seen where this road leads. The question is, are we seeing it again? We talk about the Holocaust's end, but how did it truly begin? The answer is not in the gas chambers or the death camps. The answer lies in ordinary laws made by ordinary men. The path to genocide was not a sudden explosion of violence. It was a staircase, built one legal step at a time, descending into darkness. Each step seemed small, almost bureaucratic to some. But where was this staircase leading? When Adolf Hitler became chancellor in 1933, he did not immediately call for mass murder. First, he had to weaponize the state itself. He had to define the enemy in the cold, hard language of the law. The first moves were subtle. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service, passed in April of that year, sounded mundane, even restorative. But its purpose was chilling, to purge Jewish people and political opponents from all government positions. It was the first legal wall built between a citizen and their country, and it was just the beginning. The turning point came in 1935 at the annual Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg. Two laws were announced that would forever codify hatred. The Reich Citizenship Law declared that only those of German or related blood could be citizens. In an instant, Germany's Jews were stripped of their citizenship, becoming mere subjects of the state in the land of their birth. Then came the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor. It outlawed marriages and any intimate relationships between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. These laws were not just about restrictions. They were about something far more sinister. They were a legal and biological declaration that an entire group of people were alien, a contamination to be isolated. What does a state do once it has legally defined a people as no longer belonging? After Nuremberg, the legal assault intensified. Over the next 3 years, more than 400 decrees and regulations systematically dismantled Jewish life. They were barred from public schools and universities, from parks, from cinemas. Their businesses were forcibly Aryanized, their passports stamped with a large red letter J. This was a process of error. Then came the night of November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. The laws had created the target. Now, organized violence was unleashed. Synagogues burned, businesses were destroyed, and thousands were arrested. But this pogrom was not the final act. It was a test, a brutal survey to see how the German people and the world would react to open violence, and the reaction was mostly silence. Following the invasion of Poland in 1939, the policy entered a new, terrifying phase. From segregation and era ghettos were established in cities across occupied Eastern Europe. The Warsaw Ghetto, the Łódź Ghetto. These were not neighborhoods. They were sealed, overcrowded urban prisons. starvation, and disease were deliberately allowed to run rampant, a form of passive extermination. Hundreds of thousands of people were herded behind walls and barbed wire, cut off from the world, awaiting their fate. But why go to such lengths to concentrate them in one place? The horrifying answer was finalized at a quiet lakeside villa outside Berlin. On January 20th, 1942, at the Wannsee Conference, 15 high-ranking Nazi officials met. They did not debate if they should murder the 11 million Jews of Europe. They met to coordinate the logistics of how the language of their meeting was chillingly bureaucratic, speaking of evacuation to the east and special treatment. These were the final euphemisms for a plan of industrialized mass murder. The ghettos were to be emptied, their inhabitants transported by rail to newly constructed extermination camps. The legal framework that began by defining who was a Jew had now enabled an industrial killing machine. Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor. The names are now synonymous with the abyss of human cruelty. 6 million Jews were murdered, millions of others, Roma people, Slavs, political dissidents, homosexuals, and the disabled, were also consumed by this state-sponsored hatred. The Holocaust was the horrifying climax of a slow, deliberate process that began with words, was codified by law, and was executed by a bureaucracy. It is a somber, urgent reminder that genocide is never a spontaneous event. It requires the machinery of a state, the complicity of a population, and a legal system that methodically dehumanizes its victims step by step. And this is the warning for our time. The language of us versus them, the passage of laws that single out a specific group, the gradual erosion of rights. These are not just echoes of a distant history. They are the footsteps of the past, and we must always ask ourselves, are we listening for them today? The monsters of yesterday wear new faces today. And your silence? It is their greatest ally. This is why you need to know. We tell ourselves stories to feel safe, stories that end with a clear victory, a definitive never again. The year was 1945. The concentration camps were liberated, the world saw the unimaginable, and a promise was made. But what if that promise was built on a fragile foundation? What if the ideology that fueled the gas chambers never truly died, but simply went into hiding, waiting for a new opportunity? The story, we are told, is that after 1945, the world confronted its demons. The Nuremberg trials held some accountable. But this is a dangerously incomplete picture. In the rubble of Europe, the ancient hatred of antisemitism did not just vanish. It mutated, taking on new forms, hiding in plain sight. For a time it became socially unacceptable, a mark of the defeated and the depraved. But the virus of this prejudice remained dormant in the bloodstream of societies, both East and West, and it found a new, powerful host to infect: the complex and volatile geopolitics of the post-war world. How did it manage this so effectively? Let us turn our attention to the Soviet Union. Officially, the state was anti-fascist, but in practice, a new state-sponsored anti-Semitism began to fester. Under Stalin, the so-called doctor's plot in the early 1950s accused prominent, mostly Jewish doctors of conspiring to assassinate Soviet leaders. It was a lie, a fabrication built on centuries-old tropes. They were not called Jews explicitly in every piece of propaganda. Instead, they were labeled rootless cosmopolitans, a coded language designed to signal their otherness, their supposed disloyalty to the state. This was not about religion anymore. It was about political allegiance. The old hatred was given a new, politically acceptable mask. But what happened when this mask was adopted elsewhere? As we move into the 1960s and 70s, the conversation shifts again. A new form of anti-Semitism began to emerge from unexpected corners, particularly within certain factions of the New Left. Criticism of a nation-state's policies is, of course, a legitimate part of political discourse. But something else was happening here. The lines began to blur. Legitimate criticism of Israeli government policy was increasingly replaced with a wholesale rejection of the Jewish people's right to self-determination. The Star of David was equated with the swastika in protests. Ancient stereotypes of Jewish power, control, and manipulation were simply repackaged for a new era, now cloaked in the language of anti-imperialism. How could so many claiming to fight for justice fall into such an old trap? Then came the Internet, a tool for global connection, for knowledge, but also a petri dish for hatred to grow at an unprecedented speed. Online forums, social media, and encrypted messaging applications became the new beer halls, where conspiracy theories could flourish without consequence. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a century-old forgery, was no longer a dusty pamphlet, but a downloadable file, shared thousands of times a minute. Tropes of global cabals controlling banks and media found a vast, new, and impressionable audience. The algorithm, designed to maximize engagement, often rewards outrage and extremism, pushing users down rabbit holes of disinformation. And what lies at the bottom of so many of those rabbit holes? Which brings us to today, right now. The monster is no longer hiding. We see it in the desecration of synagogues and cemeteries. We hear it in the chants on university campuses that call not for peace, but for the elimination of a people. We see it when historical events are denied or distorted, when the suffering of one group is used to justify hatred against another. The masks are slipping. The coded language is becoming more overt. The old lies are being spoken with a terrifying new confidence. Why is this happening now with such ferocity? It is because we have allowed our collective memory to fade. We have traded historical understanding for simple, comfortable narratives. We have failed to teach empathy. This is not just a story about the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism has always been the canary in the coal mine for society. It is a symptom of a deeper sickness, a breakdown in reason, empathy, and democratic values that threatens everyone. When a society tolerates the dehumanization of one group, it sets a precedent for all others. Your neighbor today, you tomorrow. So the story does not end in 1945. It ends with us, with our choice, the choice to learn, to remember, and to speak out. Because the monsters of yesterday are here, and our silence is the only permission they need.